This is Sam.
This is Paul, and this is Southpaw.
So today on the podcast, we have Sanjay Kabir Bavikatte. Hi, Sanjay.
Hey, Sam.
So could you introduce yourself to our audience? Because you probably know yourself better than we do.
Let's see now.
Yeah, consider us complete laymen and just like as simple as possible.
As simple as possible. Okay, there is a connection to martial arts. The art form is about connecting. It's truly about connecting. It's not just only in terms of how do you connect a punch or how do you connect a kick, but it is truly engaging in that kind of a dance with your opponent. I'm not talking about necessarily a street fight, where even there is a component of that. But essentially, when you are in the dojo, when you're doing your nevaza, when you're doing your tachiwaja, when you're essentially sparring, so to speak, or your randori, it is a really rich conversation one is having with one's partner. And so it isn't about winning or losing, but it's about genuinely connecting and seeing what is this beautiful conversation we can develop as a result of that. And I think some of the best matches that I have seen, or the randoris that I have seen, has been when this connection is there, and it's the connection that leads. It's no longer about me versus somebody else, but it's the harmony of the connection. Now, the reason I'm saying all this is I do a lot of work. I mean, I trained as an attorney, and I do a lot of. I started out doing a lot of work um, on environmental law and human rights, but fundamentally working with Indigenous peoples or communities who are working on stewarding their lands, resources, and territories. And a lot of what drew me to this work was what I sensed was this incredible connection these communities had with their lands, or with the ecosystem, or with the landscapes that they'd stewarded for several generations. And this connection uh, is almost, I mean, the only way to describe it is that the natural world is also a social world. And for these communities, it was a strong social connections with all sentient and non-sentient beings in their landscape. And that was what had led to these generations of stewardship and co-evolved ecosystems. So as an attorney, I spent 20 years doing that kind of work and representing these communities and the land claims and territorial claims, but also how they could safeguard and sustain their ways of life. And currently, what I do in my job is I head a foundation. It's a private foundation, and we fund a lot of work with Indigenous peoples world over. But all of it is focusing on strengthening this connection of stewardship between communities and their lands. And all of these are, I think, philosophies of connection. It's how does one genuinely connect with things around one? Because I think for most part, we tend to live our lives out as fairly isolated or closed senses of self, as to me as a separate person. And you are a person, but so much of life is about the dance. It's the great dance of connection. And I think martial arts tends to do that, and Japanese martial arts particularly tend to emphasize the dance, or the ki, or the chi, or and of course the Chinese arts as well talk about the whole thing. And if you talk about Aikido or Judo, that's always the principle of how do you use these kind of energies. And so that continues to gravitate me towards it, because it is about understanding, tapping into, and aligning two energies that are mysterious and bigger than you, but are manifested through you.
We have so many questions for you because environmental law, from the bits we do know about it, it does seem so important. Something everyone should know about, but no one's really talking about it. No one's just educating the regular people about it, at least not on any podcast I've heard. So we wanted to bring you on so you can pretend we're kindergartners and educate us. And then as you're explaining stuff, then we'll kind of know more and then you could get more technical. First, let's start off with what is environmental law and what do environmental lawyers do?
Environmental law is a set of rules, you could, or a framework of rules that govern the management of the environment, the natural environment, so to speak. And so that's what environmental law is. And environmental law lawyers are practitioners of it. Now, you could be an environmental lawyer and you could have a particular slant towards it. For example, you could be representing an oil company, or you could be representing a mining company, and essentially you have expertise in how does one use environmental law in order to further the interests of your clients. Or you could also be someone as an attorney who specializes in environmental law, but essentially, your slant could be how do I further the interests of the natural world itself, in terms of whether it is about communities who care for and tend this natural world, or whether it is for a river itself or a forest. How do I use the law in a way to protect and advance the interests of the natural world?
So the type of law you do then it seems like, or maybe environmental law in general, it tends to be more international, right? The law we're used to is more domestic and you're handling more local things or things that would only affect us here in the US. But environmental law that you will practice, you're trying to practice law in different countries or with situations that might border multiple countries, right?
Yes. So ultimately, any framework of rules essentially has to define who it is governing. So it could be governing, members of a particular community in a small town. It could be municipal regulations, or it could be for an entire state, or it could be an entire country, or it could be for the comity of nations. We have different countries, and how do we regulate, our relationships with each other in the context of the living environment that we all share. So, if you look at climate change, for example, a lot of climate change related laws, you could look at it from an international level because climate change affects everybody. So, excessive emissions by one country affects the well-being of people globally, not just in that particular country. So you do need a framework convention, which is the climate change convention that countries sign on to. But at the same time, each individual country has specific emissions targets that they would have to meet, which means that domestically they've got to enact legislation to ensure that their emissions meet these targets, which means they may have to regulate, industry in terms of how much it emits. So they may have to regulate how much emissions you can have on your car or whatever it is. So they've got to do that, and it could go down specifically to a local level as well in terms of a municipality regulating what is needed. But all of this adds up. So me as a practitioner, I've done a lot of work internationally, but I've had to also simultaneously work with specific countries to say, okay, how does your national legislation harmonize internationally? What is it that you need to do? But ultimately, the interest that I was representing in all the fields that I was operating in, whether it was at a national level or an international level, I was representing the interests of communities on the ground and nature itself to say, how do I use the law or use the skills that I have to advance the interests of those who are focused on conservation and the sustainable use of the living ecosystem of which we are a part of.
Each country has their own set of laws, but if that country or several countries sign off on an accord or a convention, then they have some kind of common agreement. And then you could come in and be like, okay, so according to these agreements, you can enforce things in multiple countries, right? Is that why those kind of conventions are so important to create a common legal ground?
Yes, exactly. So, of course, I mean, in international law, every country is a sovereign, which means that no other country can tell them what to do. However, the fact is that the reason why we have the United Nations is that we all irrespective of our sovereignty as countries, we all live on planet Earth, and it is a kind of a spaceship, so to speak, in the sense of, it's got a finite set of resources, and all our fates are tied to each other. So whether it's a treaty around nuclear disarmament or whether it's a treaty around climate change, as countries, we have to agree on the rules of engagement amongst ourselves, and that would be a treaty or a convention. That's international law. And then from there, domestically, each country would then have to do the implementation, and that for that they would have to enact legislation domestically. So it's that constant kind of balancing act between knowing that you're not the only country in the world, you are amongst you a committee of nations, and there are rules of how you engage with each other, which is what international law kind of frames out. And then from there, within within your own country, what is the level of accountability you have to people who vote that government into power, and what is it that they expect? What is the Green Deal, for example, or what is the expectation of the population around emissions relating to climate change? So all of this then becomes domestic, that the country would have to enact. So every government has to perform this kind of balancing act between upholding its international obligations and at the same time listening to its electorate or constituencies that voted into power and what they want.
It kind of connects to what you were saying before about your attraction to martial arts, then, because it is so complex and there's this macro, micro level of it. It is this kind of dance.
Indeed, indeed. So, and it is a dance, and you've got environmental lawyers working at multiple levels. There are people who focus primarily on the local, and there are people who work at a national level, and others who work at an international level. I mean, my own experience of background is that I try to do, I try to connect these different fields. I try to look at what are the gains that we're making in international law, for example, and then how does one translate that into domestic law, and how does that kind of actually result in real benefit or change for communities on the ground? Because I mean, ultimately, for me, the entire approach has been to ask myself, you know, the big question: why do I do what I do? And and ultimately, it comes from a genuine kind of a love or connection to nature, to the earth. And the question then is, what can one do to protect this? What can one do if for me, if my article of faith is that I am not apart from nature, I'm a part of it, and I am one among all of this, and it's these, the plants and the trees and the rocks and the rivers, I mean, these are all my kin. I have a strong relationship to all of them. And how do I protect it? I use the law to do it. Somebody else could use something else. Somebody else could, do run a community garden in the neighborhood, or somebody else could, advocate for for technology that reduces emissions. But I mean, there are various ways of doing it, but ultimately this is why I do what I do. But the law then is just becomes a means to an end, as opposed to an end in itself.
I know we spoke at a great length about climate change, but there's many facets to environmental law. You mentioned before about biocultural diversity. Could you explain that in layman's terms for us?
I mean, here's how I've understood it. I mean, it's as I said, the natural world is not just something outside there. I think sometimes, when we inhabit a time in the history of the world, which scientists refer to as the Anthropocene, and the Anthropocene essentially is a time when humans had the greatest impact on 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 the planet. Just in terms of our activities, have a huge impact on the planet. But so much of how we have done, what has led us to this point where in many ways we are in a very precarious time, especially in terms of what this means to the planet, and how sustainable it is for the future generations. A lot of what has brought us to this precipice or this brink uh, is how we is the change that has happened over the years in terms of how we understand our relationship to nature. Whereas traditionally especially with the indigenous communities that or peoples that I have worked with, the relationship to nature is one of kinship, where communities don't see themselves as separate, but they see themselves as a part of it. So the bio part of it, the bio meaning, the life forms amidst which they live, uh, has a cultural dimension to it. So it isn't some wild nature out there that you put in a national park and then you go back and live in suburbia or something like that. But your notions of self, who you are as a person, and your daily practices in life, uh, that is your culture. How your culture informs who you are and what you must do and how you must live is integrally intertwined with the rhythms of nature itself. So when I say biocultural, what I mean is that uh, it is a complex interaction between the culture of a people and the ecosystem within which they inhabit. And the ethical basis of that is one of care. That you truly care for these things around you, simply because you don't, as a human being, you don't see yourself as top of the hill, or you don't see yourself as something that stands apart in nature, being only as a resource that you consume, or something for aesthetic purposes that you go out once in a way and you say, watch a beautiful sunset. But it's essentially a part of your family. And so the biocultural part of it is a lot of the work that I do today is supporting these strong biocultural relationships between communities and their lands, because I feel that the future of conservation is not a kind of conservation without people, but rather it is with people, but people remembering their original relationships they have with nature.
What it sounds like to me is the way we've kind of understood it before is we think of the biological environment as independent of people. But what you're saying is you can't understand culture or biology individually. You could only understand them together as one idea or one unit.
Yes, I'm saying that as a normative statement. I'm saying that's the way we should be doing it.
Mm-hmm.
But increasingly, what is happening is that I think, as a species, and I mean, not everybody, but definitely the dominant understanding now seems to be the way we understand culture is almost completely cut off from our relationships to the living world. Instead, culture is primarily understood as interactions between human beings, and but we are only one among many. We're only one species, and so a lot. So the other way of doing it is to kind of say, even going back, 50 or 100 years ago. I mean, because if you look at the evolution of human beings itself, I mean, I think the Homo sapien. I mean, this uh, it's the latest iteration of something that kind of goes all the way back to the Australopithecus, and this is a very very recent evolutionary step. But for hundreds of thousands of years before that, the what it meant to be human was this dynamic conversation with the living world around us. It's only of late that connection has been cut off, and that is what has led to this, what I call before the Anthropocene, where we have such an immense impact on the natural world, almost to not just the detriment of the natural world, but to our own detriment. So I think so much of the climate change conversations, I mean, irrespective of what side of the spectrum you're on or not, if 90 odd percent of the scientific community agrees that as a species, we are facing an existential question. It's no longer about what do we want to leave for 5 or 6 generations down the line, but over the next 40 or 50 years, everything around us is going to change so radically that there are questions in terms of how sustainable is the planet itself for not just all the species that are disappearing, but for humanity itself.
This reminds me of kind of a fallacy I've seen in understanding Eastern philosophy like Taoism.
Yeah.
And I think Taoism has a lot in common with a lot of native philosophies, a lot of indigenous philosophies. People have turned it into dualism, this Western concept of dualism. It's either or, it's this versus that. is competitive, right? So even when you think of yin yang, people call it yin and yang, as if it's two separate ideas and then it vacillates from one and the other. When the truest translation would be yin dash yang as one idea is yin yang. It's one thing. You can't understand one without the other. It's actually one compound thing.
Yes.
And that's what it sounds like a lot of native philosophies and people, the way they understand their connection with the world. It's not man versus nature. It's man nature.
Yeah.
You can't understand one without context in the other. And I think that is the truer way to understand this, especially for our own benefit of keeping the planet around.
I mean, you're absolutely right, Sam, because I think the great lie that a lot of us have grown up with is to think of ourselves as separate from the living world or nature, and so much of what we see um, as the psychosocial challenges that that people experience, living in kind of urban built up areas increasingly. I think there is enough data and scientific research to show that a lot of it is a result of this severing of our relationship with the natural world, and so much of the discourse now around what does it mean to heal involves reconnecting with nature, and and I'm not, I mean, I know this sounds quite theoretical, but what I would invite your listeners to do is you know I mean, to go out and spend some time in nature, not as a one-off thing, because the first time you probably do it. I mean, I think the first, I mean, it's the experience is probably one of annoyance, or too many bugs, or it's too hot, it's too cold, or whatever it is. But if one does it over a sustained period of time, even over a period of 15 or 20 days, where you spend a certain portion of your time, even if it's an hour or two, in nature, in your local park or in some kind of wilderness, uh, it dramatically changes how you feel, and this kind of shows. I mean, this whole thing is hardwired in our DNA, and what well-being means for us is not just well-being separate from, and I mean, it's a simple little experiment would be, if you ask people to just close their eyes and center themselves, take a few deep breaths, and you say, imagine a really really peaceful place where you feel completely at one, and you feel really calm and balanced. Most people, you ask them to open their eyes in 20 seconds and tell you what it is, it would be a place of nature. It wouldn't be in your bedroom, or it wouldn't be in a mall, or it wouldn't be in a restaurant, or whatever it is. And there's something there around why people say that. And so what I'm talking about is connection, and the link to martial arts is I think, um, I mean, yes, the technique is important, but a lot of that technique is about understanding how energies flow, and being able to use that well. But there are energies that go beyond the interrelationship between two people, and those are energies of the world itself. And I think, uh, uh, you know, uh, I think Morihei Ueshiba, the founder of Aikido, I think he talks about this a lot. He talks about these universal energies, and I think your reference to Taoism, because Taoism is fundamentally a nature based philosophy. It is about watching the rhythms and the seasons, and how, I mean, so the Tao Te Ching makes a lot of references to the way, but I think the Taoist sages, I mean, the understanding of the way is comes from seeing how nature itself works, and then trying to then connect with the microcosm within themselves, which is actually a representation of the macrocosm they see around them.
I know we spoke about the cultural challenges that we've come across when it comes to addressing biodiversity, but what are some of the legal challenges that you encounter?
I think, I mean, so there are several legal challenges, but I think I'll bring it down to the nub of it, or the heart of the matter, and it comes down to a value, because so much of the legal challenges are kind of pitched as man versus nature, And I'll say, I mean, it's never presented as a binary as stark as that. But you take, for example, uh, let's say you take mining, for example, you take coal mining, for example. I mean, and clearly, it has had over the years a devastating impact on on the areas where the mining has happened, and now at this stage, it's kind of undeniable what continued and excessive burning of fossil fuels is doing to climate itself, and consequently through that to how we live our lives, whether it's kind of increasing amount of droughts or excessive amount of rain in certain places. There's all that that is happening now. Invariably, that to mine or not to mine, as a question, is presented as either do you want jobs or don't you want jobs, right? I mean, so ultimately, and I think it's a fair point. I mean, and because I think jobs are important, and I think at some level everyone having a way of life that augments their well-being is critical, and I think I'm all for that. But if you don't also ask the question of what does this mean for future generations? What does this mean for the living earth? And what does it mean for the trees and the plants and all of that, and the species, all of which are probably going to die as a result of all these changes that are happening? Then you're not looking at the whole picture. Then you are making decisions primarily from a anthropocentric framework. You're saying, as people, environmentalists don't, just want to protect the area, and but people who are focused on jobs want jobs in mining. So that's the entire conversation is framed in that particular way. And so what I would say is, I would say, if you take a step back, and if you kind of say, if you approach it saying that these things that we are talking about, the trees, the plants, the animals, all these other things, I mean, this living world that we're talking about is not a resource that we should we can consume endlessly. Neither is it a separate resource that we protect a few national parks in a few different places and then we're okay. But we look at it as a living world, as something that is connected to us, as kinship. Then the conversation itself becomes different. So it isn't so much about, okay, what do we do about jobs, but it's about how do you create the kind of jobs that allow us to be in harmony with the living world. And it's always, it's the with, it's not either or, and that's really what it means to connect with the energies beyond us.
Speaking on that, have you seen the effects of climate change on the ground in the regions that you've been and have done projects on?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that has been undeniable in terms of. I mean, both there's both kind of uh, data that has been painstakingly collected and day-to-day experiences of communities that who have spent their entire lives depending on I mean, depending on in the, almost in a sense of a real sense on weather patterns, and whether it's in the Arctic or whether it is in in places like the African Rift Valley. One can see the impact. One can see the impact. That uh, over the last, say, 20 years or even the last 30 years. So I think that is undeniable, because you're already seeing species migrations, because as the temperature, as weather patterns in certain places change. I mean, weather patterns in terms of sustained weather patterns, therefore the climate in certain areas change, entire species move. So you no longer, so where people may have been living in a certain ecosystem and over centuries have developed a certain understanding of it based on the kind of plants and animals and etc. that they've relied upon. And once climate in these places change, entire species start migrating out. Even plants start moving. So that impact is there, and it's interesting. I mean, I think some of your listeners may be interested in this, because it's not just in terms of then what happens to the ecosystem in a particular place, but rather it has huge implications, which are socio-political implications. I mean, one of the there is definitely one school of thought, and there's some research that's been done on this, where you talk about, I mean, where they link the civil war in Syria to to a sustained period of drought, which has never happened before in Syria, which has kind of been linked to climate change, and what that led to is an increased kind of conflict, more and more social protests, and that kind of led to that led to, there was a lightning rod there, and a certain kind of riot happened. One thing led to the other, and that led, essentially, you're looking at mass migrations of people in, and where do these people go? Where will they go? They will come as caravans, or they will come as people who will seek refuge in other places, and sooner or later, it's going to come back to your doorstep, whoever we are. I mean, for example, it's that always the same connection we make. I mean, if you don't want refugees, then don't sell arms to the countries. Which, so it's the same thing. I mean, you can't. It's still one Earth. I mean, there is no elsewhere. I mean, you can't outsource the problem to Mars or whatever it is. Whatever you do will have an implication, because it's a fairly networked world. I mean, there's no denying that. I mean, the economy is networked, and we are connected in terms of telecommunications, and we are also then always connected in terms of nature and life.
Despite the overwhelming amount of scientific evidence, do you run across challenges maybe in the legal field or against other quote unquote academics who challenge the climate science itself?
It's rare. I mean, I'm sure there are people who still kind of hold a certain line on it, but really, I mean, the gold standard on climate change science is the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I mean, this is the largest and the most respected body of scientists in the world that produce the evidence and the data that inform the work of or the negotiations amongst countries within what is called the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the Climate Change Convention, or Climate Convention, which has had several agreements after that. So the Paris Agreement being one of the more recent kind of agreements relating to emissions. But the fact is that these decisions and these negotiations among these countries, I mean, they don't happen in vacuum. It's not based on anecdotal evidence. I mean, there is an entire legally recognized body of scientists who constantly produce data based on research in terms. And so uh, those who kind of break ranks with something like this, it's definitely a minority. I mean, I think a few months ago, the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a scientific body, I mean, produced a report. I mean, where they talk about the fact that any further kind of increase in temperature. I mean, in 20 years, you're talking about 80% of the coral reefs are gone. That's a big thing. I mean, to be able to talk about 80% of the coral reefs gone, because you can imagine what that means for how it affects marine life, and once it starts affecting marine life, how it would affect human life and people who live by it. So you definitely have people who hold out, and so much of the uh, the but the litigation that happens, or the legal arguments that kind of are related to this. I mean, I think lawyers rely on science, or they rely on whatever else they need to rely on to win an argument. But fundamentally, increasingly courts are moving in the direction where they are saying that pollution is bad, it's wrong. It's not just because it affects human life, but it affects everybody, everything around us. And so uh, I mean, the fact that there is a push to conservation, or the fact that there is a push to more and more environmentally friendly law and policy, is because of an acknowledgement of this. So it's the only thing I'd say is that while there are people who are resisting, and I think there is still a lot of resistance to it, I kind of going to quote Martin Luther King, who said, the the I mean, the moral arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice, and it's the same thing with this, that we've had this long arc, but increasingly it is bending towards justice. I mean, and which is probably why the reactions are so vociferous now, because more and more people are kind of understanding that it's not sustainable the way we live.
I can't speak for other countries, but there seems to be a growing amount of skeptics, especially within the right wing community, that says, well, you can't prove that climate change is man made. And it doesn't help that there are certain lawyers that companies, especially within the fossil fuel industries, will hire that will speak on their behalf that say, oh, you can't really prove that our company or what we're doing is causing an impact to the environment.
I mean, indeed, and that is the nature of any of these things. That at some level, there is going to be a certain amount of self-interest, and clearly, when a particular way of doing business is affected, there is going to be a reaction to it. But however, I think it's important to also kind of see the market trends that are currently emerging. I mean, it's not while some companies may kind of hold out, just like maybe tobacco companies held out for a really long time, saying smoking doesn't cause cancer, and now we're in a very different world today in terms of how we see these things. Similarly, in terms of how, for example, what how big and burgeoning the kind of clean tech industry currently is, and a lot of it is because increasingly, industry and business kind of understands not only the ethical importance of doing what we do, but also, as more and more companies doing it, that it becomes also financially viable to move in this particular direction. So that is definitely one thing that's quite obvious, and you have more and more investors kind of moving in the direction of what is called impact investing, where they're refusing to invest in kind of fossil fuel companies, for example, and increasingly investing in companies that kind of abide by some kind of ESG standards. And whereas even 10 years ago you could say, well, but those kinds of investments don't yield the same kind of return as mainstream investments, where you kind of invest in all the Fortune 500 companies on the stock exchange. But you can't say that anymore, because I think certain funds have proven they've proven a 10 to 12 year track record that has shown that more and more investors want to invest in clean companies, and you can get similar or better returns. So I also feel that in one sense, it's not only communities on the ground that are fighting, but it's also consumers who are increasingly demanding certain kinds of produce or products that are manufactured in a clean way, and also then several companies kind of uh, getting on board with this. So it's the tide is turning, and well, while there may be some groups that are holding out, I don't think that this is the future. My only concern is whether we're doing this fast enough, because we don't have all the time in the world. And that's what the recent IPCC report says, that if we don't start making some radical kind of choices and cuts, uh, all bets are off in the next 20 years, and then nobody knows what happens when a system reboots.
So it sounds like the general sentiment is that, and even just eyes on the ground, we could kind of see that people are caring more about the environment and more concerned about climate change. And the market is adjusting as well. And what you're saying is, in general, there is a consensus agreement among the experts. But we have a president who's kind of radical in that he doesn't necessarily believe in climate change or man made climate change in Donald Trump. Now, my question is his view, or in his capacity as president, when he doesn't sign on to the Paris Climate Accord, or he himself is, basically a denier of climate change, is that disruption more symbolic then because everything is moving that way, or he as a president does affect the fight against climate change?
I mean, he definitely does. I mean, if the United States kind of says they're going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, I mean, it definitely has implications. But on the other hand, you know, I mean, and I'm a bit of an optimist here, and I'd like to kind of see what are the things that you know, go- in a federal system like the United States, what are the things that the federal government doesn't have that much control over on certain things? I mean, if you look at California, where we both are in, I mean, this is the state. It's the seventh. It's probably the sixth or the seventh largest economy in the world. And Governor Jerry Brown recently, I think it was in September last year, he organized the Global Climate Action Summit in California, where he says, "Fine, if the federal government wants to kind of withdraw from the Paris Agreement, as the state, we will have a climate summit where we're going to invite." Big investors. We're going to invite activists. We're going to invite industry. We're going to invite a variety of players to make our own commitments towards it. So I think what I would say is, I mean, clearly fine. I mean, I think if the president has a particular point of view, and it's a, I mean, when you, because the whole question is, again, I mean, if you frame the question of do you believe in climate change or not, I mean, we're still kind of in the realm of belief, and to deny essentially is to be say that even though 86 or 87% of of scientists in the world agree that this is what it is, I will still hold out for reasons best known to me. The question then is what happens, because markets will change, because what people insure, what they're unwilling to insure, what tech companies are increasing trying to move towards, all of that is changing, so investors will follow suit. Consumer behavior is also increasingly changing, and at the same time you have a huge amount of activism that's happening on the ground, because I mean, the treaties that we have, these international treaties, whether it's the Climate Change Convention or the Convention on Biological Diversity, etc., I mean, this is a result of several years of bottom up organizing. And so while a president with a particular term limit may come and speak to a particular section of the electorate to say, I don't believe in this or I don't believe in that, as we have seen now, I mean, and I think it's becoming increasingly obvious with the kind of shutdown that's happened. There are limits to presidential power because we live in a networked world. So you could say that. I mean, you could be like King Canute and you could sit on the shore of the sea and say, I command the waves not to come, and wet my feet. But as I said, it's the long arc of history. It's what you're saying is more as I said, a kind of a reaction to a tide that is coming towards you. And there's very little you can do. I mean, it's the same thing. Coal, for example, is getting hammered in the market, and which is why even countries like India, which had initially kind of committed to building several more coal-fired plants, have kind of are decommissioning or pulling out of coal simply because solar has gotten so much cheaper. Uh, so what I'm saying is that these things change. I mean, it goes back to it's as the means of production change, the relations of production change, and so people could say what they say, but I feel that you got to look at what is the tendency or what is in which direction it's moving. But I want to bring this back to the original point we were making, is that a lot of this stuff may sound super abstract to people to say. Okay, someone could say, you know, I have, yeah, I could, I could be someone who's running a dojo somewhere, or I could be someone, who's a software programmer. But uh, so what? All this is all the big stuff. But I live in, in San Francisco, or I live in Los Angeles, or I live in New York. I live in the city. I've got my day job. I have a full life. And of course, okay, I try to eat organic, or I try to buy in places where it's ethically sourced, but that's as far as I can go. So what else can I do? And I say that, you know, don't discount how ultimately a lot of this comes from the kind of relationship one has with something that they value. So I would say, whether it's with your children or whether it's with yourself, it's important to really kind of reinforce your connection to nature. And once you do that, then you'll start seeing little things that you need to do to protect the living environment around you. You take, for example, parents and kids. I mean, everybody's got. I mean, several. I mean, people have children, and you could ask the big question of what can I do about the public education system. I'm just one person with two kids living somewhere. But the reality is that you truly love your kids and you'll do anything for them. And you will try as far as possible, even that little school where your kids go to try and make sure that they've got the best education possible to the extent you can afford. And it's the same thing with your relationship with nature. Wherever you're living, whatever it is, if you can do your bit to protect and to sustain and to connect, then that adds up to something much bigger. And so that's what I would say in terms of the connection that I said right at the beginning, that to reinforce these connections become really important. And that's environmentalism at an individual level.
To just have an idea of how much things have changed in our previous conceptions about challenges to biocultural diversity. We worried more about in the past, maybe in the 90s or in the early 2000s, more about urban encroachment. We thought that was the biggest threat. Would you say now we're at a tipping point where that's also a threat, but maybe climate change has surpassed that as the more existential threat?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think climate change becomes an existential threat simply because the current understanding of climate change and what science says that you've got a clock ticking. So there's it's not so much in terms of how long can we push this, but how much time do we have left, before certain things start happening where things completely get out of our control. So that climate change becomes the existential threat. But really, I think the place where what I do on a daily basis is I I acknowledge that, but the I kind of bring it back down to, so therefore, what is it that we could do to address a larger threat like that? Okay, now some people could say, okay, fine, we must invest more and more in clean technology or in technology that is going to, whatever, suck this much carbon dioxide out of the air, or electric cars, all that other stuff, and or more and more solar powered houses, and there is a really important place for that. But the place where I'm also kind of pushing at is to say that, uh, you know, to also support, people or groups or communities that have for generations, taken care of these uh, ecosystems that we all benefit from, because these are the lungs of the world, and these are the carbon sinks. So, for example, if you look at indigenous peoples, I mean, they constitute about 3% of the world's population, but their territories host about 80% of the world's biological diversity. So there's something to be said about that. And I would say that what people living in urban areas can learn from these communities is the fact that to reestablish their connection with nature. And so even if it means whatever it is, your local park or your local, how you live your life, I think try to live your life mindfully, where it reinforces that connection, as opposed to saying, I've lived my life and I have nothing to do with nature around me.
I think also, and this isn't really a question, it's for the listeners, because you mentioned earlier about Syria and some of the environmental influences of that war. If people want to look that up, they could also look up something like Darfur, which was even before Syria, that led to a lot of, actual people fighting and killing each other. So we might start seeing more of that in the future if this keeps getting worse.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, ultimately, I mean, scarcity leads to consequences of some sort, and at some level, economics is the science of scarcity. I mean, it's a thing of gold would not be precious if we all had gold to spare. I mean, the fact is that it's limited resources, and there are people who demand it. But the resources that we talk about, the commons, or the public goods, so to speak, clean air, water, all these other things, we take them for granted. And so, for most part, you know, historically, businesses usually is to kind of internalize profits and externalize costs, and costs are externalized onto, into nature. Is to say, okay, fine, it doesn't cost anything to pollute, or it doesn't cost anything to, overuse water. But once these things become scarce resources, it will have implications. I mean, whereas for people, thinking about Darfur or Syria and the conflicts that are result of scarcity of resources, maybe a bridge too far. You take, for example, Beijing or New Delhi. I mean, these are highly populated cities, but increasingly, the levels of air pollution are so high that schools have to shut down frequently because it affects children's health if they go out. And what does this really mean as a social problem? Because environmental problems are never just environmental problems. They become social problems, and they become political problems, and they also then consequently become economic problems. Uh, so what does it mean for the health industry? What does it mean for all this? So I think that's why I feel that we need to have a much more holistic approach to how we think about nature, because as long as we see ourselves as separate from it, we think whatever happens there doesn't affect us, but the reality is that it affects all of us because we are a part of it.
When thinking about scarcity, there's a saying, an Asian saying that goes, loss of food, loss of minor problems. No food, one problem. And it becomes just one major problem. When you have a resource like water and you don't have it anymore, that's their only problem. And it's going to get to become a very big problem. And then it could get very hostile and violent. And I think that's the aspect of scarcity that people don't realize. When it becomes the one problem, we don't have luxuries like freedom anymore.
Hmm. Hmm. And ultimately, the problem comes in because the role of governments, whether they like it or not, is around regulating resource allocation. And if the resource starts becoming more and more scarce, then how do you do it? I mean, already you kind of see high levels of inequality is probably also linked to kind of resource allocation in terms of how much you tax, who you tax, that kind of stuff. And so much elections are won or lost based on that. So you can imagine if certain other resources become increasingly scarce, what the consequences of that are. I mean, you've seen that in several countries already. And it's only a matter of time before the chickens come home to roost.
You mentioned a little while ago about Indigenous people. And speaking on the topic of resource allocation, what kind of rights do they have? And is exploitation a big, I don't want to say factor, but how much exploitation are they suffering?
So there's been about 30 years of activism in uh, that in 2007 led to the United Nations adopting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so essentially it's a framework, it's a General Assembly resolution that acknowledges indigenous people as a people having a set of rights. And so much of a lot of the rights, it's linked to cultural and territorial self-determination, but essentially say that they have rights to their territories. So that was a big landmark moment for indigenous peoples. And if you look at the kind of rights framework we have in international law, which kind of translates to domestic law, you've got uh, you've got individual rights, which is your civil and political rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then you have the socio-economic rights, which is the kind of covenant on economic, social, and social rights. So you all of these are rights that individuals have. But when you come to indigenous peoples, it's the only group that is a recipient of these kind of group rights, because the sense of identity or self is 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 linked to place and community. So indigenous peoples do have these rights, and as a result of that, there's been a much greater advance in terms of indigenous people kind of claiming that they have rights to the territory. So any kind of activity that happens on their lands require what they call a free and prior informed consent. That is, that communities would have to give consent to activities. So previously, the lands of many of these communities could be considered as just kind of kind of a terra nullius kind of a thing, that no, it belongs to nobody. It's just these people who've just been living there, and so the governments can give leases or contracts to any company to do whatever they wanted. But not so anymore. And so, especially if you look at the decisions that have been coming about out of the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, which is the regional court that has been set up under the aegis of the Organization of American States, where several countries are members of it. You start seeing that courts are recognizing that communities have rights to their. So you're right, where on the one hand you still have a push into these lands simply because resources are becoming more and more scarce, and people can't come and drill or mine in the financial district in San Francisco. They still need to find places where they can continue to do it. But on the other hand, communities are pushing. They're fighting. They're advocating for rights. I mean, the recent Brazilian elections is an example of this kind of a of the point of conflict where in the Amazon, I mean, the Amazon is considered almost like lungs of the planet. It's critical for all of us. And now the new president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, has now kind of said that it's open season again for companies to kind of start getting into the Amazon for resource extraction, and indigenous people, of course, are kind of fighting back. But the fact that people are fighting back shows that people are indigenous peoples are really aware of what their rights are, and when a community you know is aware of their rights, they realize that they're no longer victims; they're rights holders, and when they're rights holders, they are a threat. They will stand up for themselves and they will fight, and I think that's what they're doing. And what I would conclude with saying is that the indigenous people's struggle is not only a struggle of for indigenous peoples. It is a struggle for all of us, for the whole of humanity, because we will all benefit from this, and we will all suffer as a result of a loss of the living world.
I completely agree. And there's so many good points you're making. One thing I wanted you to speak on is this concept of property rights or ownership. In the US, it's become like water, right? Where it's ubiquitous, where we've always had it, it's always around us. So we don't even know what it is or how it works or how we would even define it. And you talked about this in your book, Stewarding the Earth. But what is ownership in a legal sense and who decides? And also, what is the indigenous perspective? Because initially, to indigenous people, private property must be like trying to say you own the air. It's like, what? Because if I really think about it as an alien, like if I didn't buy into all the schemas that we, buy into now, it is a very weird concept to come upon something that nobody's owned for, millions of years, billions, whatever. There is no ownership. And then somebody plots a post there and says, it's mine now.
Yeah. I mean, and you're right. I mean, one of the things I was trying to kind of explore in my book is, I mean, when people think of property, when they think of property rights, um, you know, the popular conception, or at least the lay conception of it, is a sense that is a sense of absolute, unmitigated control over something. But the right to property, even historically in Anglo-American jurisprudence, has never been like that. We've never had absolute right to property. What we've had is, okay, people may have title to it, but they have, at least when it comes to land, they have a specific set of rights. So, for example, you take, for example, the, the the house that you live in, and you could say, well, this is my yard. I'm going to drill for oil here. But you will not be allowed to do that because you live in a neighborhood, you live in a community. There are restrictions on the exercise of your rights. And it's based on what, as a community or as a neighborhood, you agree together. So first off, I think we've got to acknowledge that private property rights, at least when it comes to land, are never absolute rights. They are always limited rights. But essentially, what you have is that you have a set of entitlements to what you could do there and what it belongs to, and so on and so forth. And so we come from there. And when we talk about, say, indigenous peoples, uh, you know, I think historically it's almost a bit of a paradigm shift where you no longer say the land belongs to me, but it starts from the perspective of I belong to this land. So you see yourself as a part of something, and you have a set of stewardship obligations. You have a set of duties to that land. Some years ago, I mean, she passed away recently, but some years ago, the Nobel Prize in Economics was given to, a woman called Elinor Ostrom. She's an American, and a lot of her work was around what she called, caring for the commons, and she understands commons as common pool resources. Where, for example, a pasture land, or for example, a community piece of land. Or a river or a lake or whatever it is that several people have interests in, and these people form a community. Now, she was responding to a dominant hypothesis at that point in time, which was called the tragedy of the commons. And this was propounded by another kind of, theorist at that point in time called Garrett Hardin. And Garrett Hardin's idea of the tragedy of the commons was that if you have if you have a resource that is shared amongst many people, human beings are, at least his understanding of human beings were that human beings tend to be rational maximizers of self-interest. So, that each human being will try to maximize whatever they can get out of it. So what then they tend to do is that everybody tries to take as much as they can out of that shared resource, or that shared grazing pasture, or that lake, or whatever it is. And sooner or later, the entire resource collapses or gets overused. So his solution or response to that is that the best thing to do is to privatize the resource, where then people will act in self-interest. So whoever owns that thing is going to kind of care for it, or you nationalize it, or the state takes over in the benefit of all. Now, what Elinor Ostrom did was, through years of painstaking research, where she and several other researchers proved that communities for generations have cared for and sustained shared resources which they did not own, or which the state was not managing. And in times when these things got privatized or took over by the state, the resource actually got collapsed. But how did communities do that? Because they had a set of rules that they all abided by, and they said that we have a set of duties to using this in a particular way that it not only benefits all of us, but several generations after that. And she lists out what the criteria were for these communities to sustainably manage these resources. I'm using this example to show that human beings, I mean, we respond to the cultures that we live in. We're not outside of history, but we don't always work as rational, as maximizers of self-interest. We also have other altruistic tendencies where we say we could care for certain things, we could use certain things collectively for the benefit of all. So you take a local dojo, for example. Yes, I mean, people may pay membership dues, but if there is a strong culture in the dojo, everyone pitches in to care for the dojo. Not you just don't go there and say, okay, I've done my training, so I'll probably just kind of slam the door and walk out. Or if the mat is torn, I don't care. But people start caring for something that they all benefit from. And so I think that's the point I'm trying to make about property. That we always kind of think of property as something that is like real estate. But uh, what if you don't see it as real estate? If you don't see it as something that's kind of fungible like that, but if you see it as land, there are various examples of people who have real connections to these things and who care for it. It doesn't matter that they have title deed to it or not, but it matters to them that this is something that they belong to and that they care for. Their ancestors have been buried here. They've had memories here. They've had a life here. And so that's my response to the kind of private property approach, to say that firstly, private property isn't how people commonly understand it. There are always restrictions on private property. But secondly, we need to kind of get that out of our head, that if it is that what does mine really mean? Uh, and 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 one of the things that I've argued in the book is to say that if you can care about something, then to some extent, then you have certain obligations to it, and you have certain rights to it. And I mean, I'll conclude with this. I mean, there's this famous story of King Solomon, where yeah, these two women, come come to him with with a baby, and they're fighting over it because each woman claims that the baby is hers, and there's no way to determine whose baby it is. I mean, this is the time before DNA tests. And so Solomon comes up with this, wise idea where he says, all right, okay, fine. I can't seem to make a decision as to whose baby it is. So why don't we cut the baby in half and eat if you get half a baby? And one woman agrees to that. And the other woman says, you just cannot do that. Let the other woman have the baby, but let the baby live and let the baby be whole. And Solomon then says, well, she is the true mother of this baby, because a real mother would never kind of allow her baby to be cut in two. But that's the principle that we're talking about here. It is a principle of care.
So instead of thinking of things like, the way we would think about things in California, where we're real estate obsessed and we just want to own stuff and make passive income, it's better to think of it less as real estate when we're thinking about land and our environment, because to your point, it really is a commons. Like if I pollute my backyard and it seeps into the ground, how does that not affect everything else? And that is something, if we spend some time thinking about it, maybe it's a conclusion we could come on our own, but we don't really ever spend time thinking about our environment. We just take it for granted.
Yeah. I mean, and that's really what it is, because ultimately, uh, you know, I'm not trying to kind of stand in a soapbox here and say, okay, eliminate private property. But what I am saying is that there are certain things that are public goods, and by public goods, what I mean is that it belongs. Everybody's well-being relies on that, and it belongs to everybody, and so everybody has a stake in it. It's not about what can I as a company do because this is my land or I've got a lease here, but everybody has a stake in it because everybody can, and everybody should contribute to the care of it. So, and I think that's really what the best kind of cities are. I mean, even if you talk about urban areas, I think the best cities are cities where people feel that it's their city, it belongs to them, and they care for it, and they pitch in, and they participate in community activities that care and grow the city. But if people start seeing a city as primarily a place where it's like it's a place where you kind of come and work and you do your thing, and you take your money out, and then you're out of it. There is no life. It's lifeless, and everybody knows the difference between a city where people feel that it belongs to them, or a town where they feel that this is their town and they are the community, versus something that is purely looked at as something to consume and use. And that's the thing. I mean, I think we're talking about soul here, and really we're talking about the relationship, and that's why it comes back to the original point I made about connection, because all these things are about a sense of connection that is beyond yourself. It's not just about acquiring or saying it belongs to me, but asking the question of what do I belong to? And when you ask that question, then suddenly you no longer, you're not surrounded by ghosts, but you have ancestors and you have community and you have all of these other things. And you're not just an individual. You're a part of a community.
So we covered a lot of things ranging from, like you mentioned, public goods, biodiversity, and climate change. But a question I had for you is, what is traditional knowledge? And in your perspective, how's that been exploited?
Traditional knowledge, one of the things is, I mean, I think traditional knowledge is not traditional because it's ancient. I mean, it is ancient also, but really, I mean, because traditional knowledge is something that's quite dynamic. What I mean by traditional knowledge is also the system of knowledge production, how knowledge is produced, and in the context of say indigenous peoples, the kind of traditional knowledge we talk about is a knowledge that comes from this close dynamic interaction or conservation or conversation people have with the ecosystem, and what they discover and learn as a result of that. And a lot of that is done in a community context. It's less about a researcher going off by himself or herself, by themselves and discovering something, but it's something that belongs to everybody, that is produced by everybody, that is built with different generations adding pieces to it, and it's dynamic and it continues to evolve in communities. It never kind of stops at any time. So broadly traditional knowledge that I'm speaking of. And when we talk about exploitation of traditional knowledge, I mean, I think a lot of it has had to do with how we all rely on this kind of traditional knowledge, whether it's in terms of phytopharmaceuticals or cosmetics or food. I mean, the entire kind of food systems that we rely on, I think, has been the result of the kind of land races that have been developed by communities. The meat that we rely on is about the kind of breeds that have been developed by people. Of course, now increasingly we have more and more monocultures because a lot of our food is produced by big agribusinesses and it's kind of focused on efficiency. But uh, a, a, a lot of the food, a lot of the medicine that we rely on and we continue to rely on, the leads come uh, from communities, and so that's what I mean in terms of traditional knowledge, and uh, and that is really the issue today in terms of when we talk about biological diversity. We are moving into an era where, with this kind of species loss and greater and greater focus towards kind of production and efficiency, that we're losing the kind of diversity of, for example, crops, or we're losing the kind of diversity of breeds, etc., that we have. And this becomes a really critical question in the context of, say, climate change, because if we start losing this kind of genetic diversity, uh, sooner or later it becomes virtually impossible to kind of adapt to changes that are happening, because suddenly you've lost different kind of varieties that facilitate this kind of adaptation. So I think, I mean, I'm kind of getting a little bit into kind of deep science here, but what I'm trying to kind of point out is that our well-being, even for a lot of us who live in cities, we are constantly consuming, whether it's in terms of food or it's in terms of medicine. We're constantly consuming things that are taken from nature, which have a basis in a certain kind of a genetic diversity. And as that we so as that kind of gets narrower and narrower, and as species are losing, we're actually starting to kind of chop down the tree of life itself, and there will be consequences as a result of that.
Would an example of this be like if a pharmaceutical company or maybe an entrepreneur goes to a certain region and the indigenous people, are willing to share their medicine or their knowledge with this person, and then they take it back and create a wonder drug or create some health food thing, and then completely exploit that land and take all the resources, but not only that, also leave the indigenous people with nothing. Like they're starving, and there's urban encroachment, and they're not sharing any of the profits. Is that kind of an example of how traditional knowledge can be exploited?
Well, that's definitely one example, and that happens a lot. I mean, that's kind of called biopiracy. I mean, it happens a lot because definitely with phytopharmaceuticals, the cosmetics, etc. Your R&D budget is kind of cut down by three-fourths if you have a lead that's already coming. So if you want to kind of find a bioactive compound that acts against cancer, or acne, or whatever it is. I mean, we know very little taxonomically of the living world. And so instead of kind of going and screening every possible plant that you can think of, which would take millions and millions and millions of dollars and a lot of time, you could go start asking, what is that people have used in this area, that when they have a certain kind of inflammation, or when they have, and sooner or later you start saying, okay, this is the plant that people have used, and so then you could go and you could kind of extract the bioactive compound, and then you could kind of turn that into a drug or a cosmetic, or a nutritional supplement, or whatever it is that you do. So yes, so in one sense, there's a huge reliance on that, and I think a lot of communities are demanding that there is some kind of a benefit sharing that comes in, because you are relying on knowledge that the community has developed and has held, and but I think the real so that's a big part about what does it mean to take the consent of the community before you do that and share the benefits with the community. But I think the real issue goes beyond that, to the extent of, uh, what does it mean to take something from the commons, from people who have kind of used and shared it, and built it up, and then produce something as a result of that and then privatize it. And when I say privatize it, I mean then you secure a patent over it. And then you say, now this belongs to me. Yes, I've invested a certain amount of research and development. And now, therefore, the final product, therefore, belongs to me because I've invested all of this. And it actually becomes unaffordable to the people who had originally kind of produced it. And I think this is the issue of privatization, where I think we do understand there's one argument to say, okay, we don't allow people to kind of privatize it. There's no incentive to do this kind of work. But on the other hand, you see entire communities of people who've developed and produce all kinds of art and food and medicine, etc., without any of this kind of incentive that comes from privatization. But how do you find the middle ground of you incentivize people to invest and develop these drugs and foods and all of that, but also kind of make sure that you don't privatize it in a way that it's inaccessible to the people or large numbers of people who need it, who can no longer afford it, but also then how does something go back to the communities that produced it? But and the connection all of this makes to go back to is that we are really not separate from this. I mean, everything we eat, we drink, that we take when we are ill, that we use on a daily basis, all of this goes back to nature. And so we are, no matter how what we think, we are highly reliant on the ecosystem. And it is this ecosystem that we got to protect because really, without it, we wouldn't be who we are.
Well, you asked a question just a couple of minutes ago about, well, how do we incentivize these behaviors out of these big companies, or maybe they're medium companies, whatever companies that come in and just kind of exploit traditional knowledge? How do we incentivize them to act as good actors?
I think that, I mean, it's already happening in several places because it's essentially, I think it's a two pronged approach. I mean, you do need clear legislation that makes it illegal or criminalizes this kind of behavior where you go, you take something that belongs to somebody else, and then you kind of you invest in research in it, and then you privatize it. I think you have increasingly have sufficient legislation around that. Under the Convention on Biological Diversity, you have something called the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing that does that, and several countries now have laws that prohibit that kind of behavior. Uh, but on the other hand, you can also incentivize it because here I'm talking about traditional knowledge, but the whole idea of bio trade or fair trade comes from this, where it's consumer demands, consumer behavior that forces companies to 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 source ethically, to source from places where they don't devastate the place where it's taken from, and consumers are willing to pay for it, demand for these kind of products, and ultimately, and that's the true cost of something, because I think a lot of what we call cheap food is subsidized food. But if you really put back all the costs that are externalized onto government or taxpayer back on the ledger, you realize that something that is produced ethically or sourced ethically is, and what you pay for is the real cost of it, and that ultimately flows back to the community. So I think it's both consumer demands of how companies behave, activism on the ground where communities saying, well, you can't do this anymore, we have our rights, to kind of legislation that makes certain kinds of behavior illegal. I think all of that would lead to this necessary kind of incentivizing.
Now, for us, because this is your world and you're used to certain jargon, so we might not be understanding a lot of these terms the same way. One of the things I noticed you were saying was stewardship, right? As opposed to just using the common term that most of us are more familiar with, which is conservation. And so what I'm understanding from what you're saying is stewardship is more of you and the land working in concert. Whereas conservation might be just this old idea of, hey, just buy up this amount of land and just say people can't do stuff on it, and we're going to conserve that land. Would you say that is the difference between stewardship versus conservation? And maybe stewardship is a better way or a more helpful way to think about it?
Yes, and I think what I'm also kind of saying is that what stewardship does is it recognizes a culture of care, of seeing something that you're a part of and caring for it. And I think what I'm saying around conservation, the traditional notions of conservation was primarily a certain kind of a fines and fences approach, where you fence off an area of land and you find people who kind of go into it and that kind of stuff. But really, I mean, I think the kind of world we live in, we don't have kind of that many lands that are completely uninhabited. There are people who have been living there, who've been taking care of it. So the culture of stewardship is to say that we all have an obligation, firstly, but then the kind of communities who have been living there and taking care of it have a set of rights, and that has to be recognized. It can't just be that either it's a national park or it's open season, but rather you have to start recognizing these indigenous and community conserved areas and then protect them because they belong to all. I mean, they benefit everybody.
So it's not just about a conservation, just buying some land and it's like set it and forget it. We can't just set it and forget it. It's a constant responsibility.
It's a constant responsibility, and it's also everybody's responsibility. And I think that's the question. I think that's the thing that I think all of us have to start grappling with. How does our lifestyle, how does our behavior, what do we do that that is able to embody and a culture of stewardship?
It sounds like you have a lot of natural optimism, but come on. Like with everything that you know, how do you not get majorly depressed working in this field?
I mean, yes, it's hard, but on the other hand, one of the things I think I would ask anyone to do who's kind of getting jaded in this um, is to actually go out and spend some time with people who are doing this on a day to day basis, um, and and that's the thing. I mean, in the sense of while people are fighting against great odds, it's also important to start seeing the successes. I mean, this is not a losing battle. I mean, this is something where, of course, I mean, we're on the clock, but on the other hand, there are great successes and there are lots of people doing some really, really amazing work. So, in one sense, yes, I mean, I'm not saying everything's going to hell in a handbasket. I'm definitely saying that yes, things are bleak. There is definitely the pessimism of the intellect, but you have to have the optimism of will because there are lots of people out there who wake up every morning and do it, and they're doing amazing work. And in many ways, I think they are also succeeding. So I feel two things. I mean, I think it's important to have faith, and I think it's important to be realistic to say that it's not. I mean, there is actually real successes that are happening out there in the world. And finally, your work has to stem from love. If you love something, you'll go out and do it. You take, for example, there's that statistic that goes around in martial arts circle is that it's like only what is the dropout rate? If you're looking at a black belt from someone who kind of starts, you say 95% of the people who start something don't get to that. That's a huge dropout rate. But people still, a lot of people, including you, I mean, you still go out and you train. I mean, you're not jaded by that kind of statistic because you know that what you do is you do it because you love it and it's important. And I think that's the whole point, to cultivate that kind of love where from that love, uh, you know, things will happen by itself. And that's what I mean when you say you align with the great energies and you connect to the great mystery, and then that will carry you. It's not all on your shoulders. You just have to, catch the wind. You have to align your sail in a way to catch that wind. Yeah.
Cultivate the love.
Cultivate the love. Yeah.
That's it. That's it. Sanjay, you are a true martial artist, I think, in the biggest sense, which is trying to cultivate the love and trying to get others to cultivate the love, but also defending and protecting our commons, our greatest commons, which is this whole planet and this whole, biosphere that we live in. So thank you for coming on the show. And are there any resources that you think are helpful online that people can learn more about all this work?
One of the things that I was always kind of that really really influenced me was Henry David Thoreau's book Walden. I'd kind of invite people to read that. It talks about this kind of the connection to nature. Um, and and watch the movies, etc. There are so many great movies that speak of these kind of connections. So what I'm saying is it doesn't have to be a purely intellectual exercise, but most importantly, I'd kind of say, go out and spend time outdoors and really spend time and start trying to get, connect to that thing. And it takes time, but when you do, you'll see what it means to really love something. And yeah, and as martial artists, I mean, that's the thing, right? I mean, ultimately, it's not valueless. It is based on the value of being a warrior for what is right, for standing up for something in your own life or in your community. And that's what it is. And this is your community, the planet, and the planet asks people to stand up for it as warriors. So I invite the martial artists to do that. I mean, in your own little way.
Here's what we can do is maybe you could email me some of the movies and books that you think are influential, and a lot of the books and other links that you mentioned throughout this talk. I'll add it all to the show notes. And other than that, that's it. Thank you, Sanjay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, guys.